Welcome to Tony at 12. I'm Tony LeBlanc, and today I'm in conversation with Tony Fowler, Associate Priest at St Anne's Church, and we're going to look at Tony's times as a prison chaplain. Tony, so good to see you, and thank you for sparing me some time.
Oh, not at all, Tony. It's good to see you too.
Now, let's start off with your ordination into the church. Had it been a career plan right from the start, or did it evolve?
No, not at all. It wasn't a plan. It's just, it actually grew over a number of years, getting involved in youth work in the local church, along with my wife, Jan. And eventually some people were saying, "Hey, Tony, we think you make a great vicar." And I thought, no, what, me? No, my idea of a vicar was very different from what it certainly is now anyway. And eventually when my wife also said, "I think you should think about becoming a vicar," then I thought, well, I'll start the whole process. And here I am now.
Well, there you go. And at what point then did you decide that you'd go into prison chaplaincy?
Well, again, it was a similar kind of experience, really. I got involved in being involved in higher and further education chaplaincy in Ipswich. And some of the young lads were coming on a special program there who were at risk of being expelled from school, excluded from school. And they had a sort of a compact where they would do some studying at the college, bricklaying and hairdressing and catering, various things, good practical stuff. And they, as long as they promised to continue going to school the rest of the week. And I started to get a sense of some of these lads who would soon end up in prison. So it's something that just grew from there, really.
So you does one make an application, or how does it work from that point of view? Is it church led or prison led?
Well, it's paid for by the prison service. So basically, what I did was I talked to some prison chaplains that I'd got to know, and went to visit them in their prisons and got a sense of it from there, and eventually just put an application into the prison service.
Yeah.
Of course, it had to be licensed by the bishop in order to be able to take the post, but it's very much Majesty's Prison Service that employed me.
Okay. And as far as the prison itself was concerned, did you have a choice there?
Well, in those days, we're talking about, I suppose, 18 years or so ago when I joined the prison service. No, you had to apply for joining the prison service, which could even mean being sent overseas.
Right.
But I was very restricted at that particular time. But in the end, when they said, "Well, yes, we'd like you to be a prison chaplain, but not where you want to go," I had to make a decision. And I felt, well, actually, as I feel this is the right thing to do, I then did a lot of commuting for some years.
Yeah.
To work and stay near the prisons where I was working, until the last prison, which is local, and I could travel from home every day.
There are three categories of prison, I believe: A, Bs, and Cs. A being the high security stuff, and C being sort of open. Were you involved in all of those, or?
No, there was actually a fourth category, which is the open prison, which is a
Right.
D-cat.
Okay.
So, but the sort of residential, permanent residential prisons are certainly A, B, and C. Now, basically, it was C category, all the prisons I worked in, although one of them was combined with the young offenders, so they sort of combined the two. But C is like the lowest category.
Mm-hmm.
A is for the sort of longer term and more serious cases. But often prisoners would actually sort of progress from an A-cat to a B-cat and then to a C-cat before they end up being released. So we'd have quite a few lifers in my last prison where I worked at High Point. There was quite a few lifers there who would have started, some of them in A-cat, but some actually who need high security will be in an A-cat prison for the whole of their sentence.
Yeah. Does places like Broadmoor and Rampton, that they're separate, are they, from the actual A, B, and C category?
I don't know the details.
Yeah.
I do know that not all the prisons, of course, are run by Her Majesty's Prison Service, because they're contracted out to other organisations who run prisons now. So it's there's no monopoly now. So there is some separation between different prisons because of the different sort of employment opportunities there.
What was it like on your first day?
It was weird. it was weird, but by then I'd visited prison a number of times, and the chaplaincy team I was working with were very, very supportive, and so was the governor. But I must admit, for the first few years, I loved getting out at lunchtime, just because I could.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
most of the people I worked with didn't have that freedom.
You had your escape route, but really, you know, it must be quite, you know, so different from ordinary life to actually sort of get into a building where people are very restricted in terms of what they can do and all this sort of stuff.
Yes, and it's a different life as well for the staff. Obviously, for the prisoners, it's hugely different. You know, there was, you know, I couldn't take a mobile phone into work, and after I've been there a few years, it actually became a criminal offence to actually walk around in prison with a mobile phone, unless you're a governor and you've got a special prison phone and what have you. Yeah, we were subject to staff searches. So when we'd go into prison, you could suddenly be told, "Can you step aside?" And we go through here, and you'd be sniffed by, you know, sniffer dogs and be searched. And so there's always a sense this is a different kind of lifestyle. Emails, we had our own email account which you could not access except you were physically in the prison. So
Right.
but that had advantages, because when I got home, I was off work.
Yeah, you didn't get a pile of things to deal with.
Exactly, very different from parish ministry.
When we spoke about this the other day, we were talking about the punishment. Prison is the punishment. Is that the way you see it, basically?
Yes, because I think a lot of people feel that prison is where you go to get punished.
Yeah.
But actually, no. The fact that you are taken out of society and you have very limited freedoms and rights, that is the punishment, that you're removed from society. So being in prison is not meant to be a punishing experience. It's meant to be a reforming and rehabilitating experience. I mean, that's another question about how successful that is. But it's important that people realize that prisoners should be treated with compassion, with kindness, and with fairness, and not sort of treated like, you know, a subhuman species.
Yeah.
And obviously, chaplaincy, we have a big role in encouraging that, in modeling that in the way that we treat prisoners inside prison.
Did you ever have a conflict of interest in terms of the fact that prisoners might say to you something that's confidential, but, you know, effectively could be a security issue? I mean,
yes,
that must have been a bit of a difficult thing as a clergyman to cope with, I would have thought.
Well, I didn't find it too difficult, because I think if you're going to work inside a prison, you have to accept the restrictions.
Yeah.
And we were told that whilst we can offer confessional type of sort of priestly confidence when prisoners come to us, we are bound by the rules and the laws of being an employee of the prison service, that if any prisoner was to disclose certain things, one of which would be if they intend to harm somebody, or if they intend to harm themselves, or if they intend to if they smuggle a bomb into the prison or something like that. I do apologise.
Don't worry. Don't worry.
And a number of other things. So when a prisoner comes and says, "Can I talk to you in private, Governor?" or whatever, and I'll say, "Well, only if you do not disclose these certain things."
Yeah, sure.
So, and they understood that. So if I say, "Well, if you're going to talk about some crime you've committed, but it's in general terms, well, I was on this job and this happened, well, that's fine. But if you say, well, actually, you know, I killed this bloke, his name was John Smith," I'd say, "Hang on, I'm afraid I've got to make sure that's passed on."
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Before.
But I mean, you would warn them beforehand that what they said to you might not necessarily be totally confidential, which is fair enough, isn't it?
Decide whether or not they want to disclose.
Yes, sure.
That didn't really cause any issues. The one time when there could be a compromise, when I saw a prisoner come in who I knew was a relative of mine.
Oh.
So I spoke to the governor, his fairly distant relative, and he said, "Well, thank you. We need to know that. We'll put that down on record. Do you think do you think we should transfer him out of the prison?" And I said, no, I don't think there's any issues here. He said, right, okay, well, we'll keep him here, but let me know if things change. So the governors are very concerned to make sure that there's no kind of issues that you can get from those kind of connections.
And the prisoner realised you were a relative?
Oh yeah, he was telling me all about how when he heard I was at one of the other family events and they told him about it. So that felt a bit weird. But I did say to him, well, look, while we're in prison, I'm the chaplain.
Yeah, just accept the status quo, as it were, from that point of view. Obviously, you were representing the Anglican Church, but did you have to deal with other faiths?
Oh yes, and we had very good relationships with the other faith chaplains. And the thing about being a prison chaplain is we are there to support all prisoners, regardless of faith.
Yeah.
And so there have been times when I've had a Muslim prisoner come to me and talk in confidence, and has even asked me to pray for them because a Muslim chaplain might have not been available, or what have you. I've got one or two very good friends who are imams, who are, before I was a prison chaplain, I don't think I could even name an imam that I knew personally, whereas now we've got friendships. And we ended up, for instance, when the Buddhists wanted to meditate, the chapel was quieter than the multi-faith room. So what would happen when we had a Bible study at the same time as the Buddhist meditation, they would do their meditation in the chapel and we would do our Bible study in the multi-faith room. So we'd work together.
Yeah.
And we were part of a chaplaincy team.
Yeah. Are there many Buddhists in jail?
There's not many, no. Proportionally, very small number.
Yeah. Okay, that's good to know. Now, we've all seen Porridge, and we are aware of a sort of class system that applied. Peter Vaughan playing the part of Grouty, who seemed to rule the place and was probably as powerful as the governor. Do those sort of circumstances really exist?
I didn't come across them, no. I mean, there's obviously a pecking order with prisoners. And a lot of that, I think, the officers on the wings would know. It's not something that we really sort of come into contact with the chaplaincy. You'd occasionally get some who think they could, thought the chaplains were born yesterday and they could persuade us to get involved in things we shouldn't. But they soon learned that no, we're pretty savvy, and so we didn't tend to get drawn into things where there'd be issues that that would affect.
Because I think we both saw that drama Time, which starred Sean Bean and Stephen Graham. That really showed it as a sort of brutal dog-eat-dog existence. And, I wonder quite how accurate that was.
Well, to be fair, I'm always very critical, obviously, when I see dramas about prison life. But I have to admit that I think overall it was a very, very good production, and there was some very thorough research. Even the little things like if that's a genuine lock with the keys, especially got two keyholes or what have you. Shouldn't give too much away about these things. But I think what I would say about it is that practically every single thing that happened there would and has happened in some prison somewhere. What was unrealistic was that the characters were condensed. Like there's only one chaplain involved in many things, where of course in reality it'd be a lot of different chaplains, and the one prison officer who's involved in just about everything. Again, there'd be lots of different prison officers and what have you. But overall, I think it was fairly accurate in terms of what was portrayed, but the balance was very much not the case. I mean, all of that would have happened over a very long space of time. You did get a clue with the numbers on the wall. But on the whole, life is, much more, relaxed to a large extent. Some prisoners come in terrified. I remember one guy who just thought he's not going to survive at all. But within a few 2 or 3 years, he was befriending others. He was a mentor. He was supporting people and was able to adapt to it. So it's not all as intense as that. But it was good drama nevertheless.
It was good drama. It's still available if anyone's watching, hasn't seen it, on the iPlayer, on the BBC iPlayer, so it's worth seeing. What about young offenders, Tony? You hear some fairly horrific tales about the place at Feltham and things like that. Was that your experience, or?
Well, when I worked at Swinford Hall, which is an adult C and young offenders, the age range would go up to about 25, rather than 21. I think it was usually the age. And there's a lot more work goes into supporting young offenders, a lot more programs. It was a big prison. And I think often the difficulty with young offenders is the same sort of difficulties that most young people face, is actually how to actually deal with growing up and maturing in a particular kind of society and community. And because being in prison, it's a bit twofold, because they'll have their gangs, their mates outside who might still want to keep in contact with them, probably for the wrong reasons. And then having to deal with the community inside prison, where there are older prisoners who actually won't tolerate some of the messing about and the problems that the young, so there's still the same kind of emotional transitional difficulties that young people have, but it's in a much more complicated and intense sort of scenario.
Did you find that, you could categorize the young offenders in terms of their family background and stuff like that?
To a certain extent, we did find that, especially with the gang culture, that a lot of the prisoners coming in would have very little positive parental background. Often find themselves unwanted on the streets. And the reason they'd get involved in crime is because they would be adopted by a gang who became their family. But of course, it was very, it's a double-pronged situation, because while you're in the family and you do what's expected, then you're looked after, you're cared for, at least they think cared for. But if you break out of that, then of course you're in very serious physical danger. So it's quite an intense place. And often when youngsters come into prison, they find it difficult to break with that, especially they know when they're released, they're going to go back into the same area. So the challenges, I think, are quite different with young offenders on the whole than from the adult population.
And I suppose part of the problem is that they do return to the same area and suddenly fall victim once again of gangs and drugs and everything else.
Yes, I mean, sometimes probation will say, well, you will not be able to live in an area, especially where the offence was committed, to protect the victims or a community. So sometimes they're put in, often they're put in hostels, bay hostels, in somewhere where they're not familiar. But that's a different challenge, because they haven't got anybody who can be a positive support for them either. So it is difficult. Youngsters.
I had a look at some stats which we've discussed in the past, in terms of numbers and cost and everything else. And according to the government website, there are about 88,000 people in England. In the UK, and in England, it worked out to 173 per 100,000. The cost is around 40,000 per annum. So it's an expensive thing, isn't it? Punishment.
Well, yes, but it's not just punishment. I mean, that the whole aim of it is to rehabilitate people, for people to come out of prison and not reoffend. So a large amount of that money, and also, of course, is just the fact that you've got to care for someone. You've got to feed them, give them somewhere to sleep, and all the resources that go around, as well as help protect them from each other, protect them from themselves, because suicide and self-harm are a big issue in prison, and I was very involved in that. So there is going to be a cost associated with it, but particularly the programs, which maybe the jury's still out in terms of how effective they are, about helping prisoners to actually turn their lives around, so they won't come back again.
Reoffending rate is allegedly 26%, and there are 22 men for each woman. So that's not surprising, the male-female stat, is it really, I guess?
Well, and I think that's been fairly constant really throughout history. But then, of course, even then, when you look at the offences that many of the women have been convicted of, a lot of them have been because of pressure from men, or doing that on behalf of men. So actually, I think the number of sort of genuine sort of criminal type women is even lower
Even
percentage.
lower, yeah,
than those that are actually in prison.
Yeah. I suppose, looking at the reoffending rate of 26%, that's still pretty high, isn't it? Did you find that some are professional criminals?
Oh, well, yes, definitely. I remember one couple I met in my first prison in their 60s, and I said, I'd like to welcome you to this prison. They said, oh, we were here when it's first built 36 years ago. And the other one says, well, we wouldn't be here now if you'd run what I told you. They're both having a good laugh about it all. I mean, it's, fairly, I don't like to sort of minimize what they did, but it's fairly, non-violent, minimal sort of crime. And the other one said, well, yeah, I think actually this is it. My last time now. I've had enough from prison life. I'm going to retire.
I'm going to retire.
So some actually are professional criminals who've got their own sort of set of what's right and wrong in life. There's not much prison can do for them.
No.
I think this is one of the important points about how effective prison is in terms of starting reoffending. Because at the end of the day, no matter how much you do for a prisoner, ultimately it's up to them to make that decision. And I think that's part of the problem. In society, we think if we throw enough programs or enough punishment, or, eventually we can force them to not reoffend. But the reality is, of course, is that if for some reason they choose not to, and sometimes it's very difficult with psychiatric illnesses and also victims of abuse and all sorts of things, it's not easy. So all we can do is try and help them, and whether we do enough to help them or not is another question, but it is down to the individual. So some will always, I think,
slip back through the net, as it were. This question of parole, we had that dreadful incident at the Fishmongers Hall in London not so long ago, where somebody attended who'd been cleared as being responsible. I think he was a bit of a radical in terms of that. And I suppose parole is really, let's sort of let the guy go and keep our fingers crossed in some cases.
Well, I hope it's not. I know a huge amount of work goes into parole and the whole probation movement in terms of, risk of reoffending. In the period of time, the 15 years or so I was in prison, it certainly seemed a lot harder for prisoners to get released. Probation started off as a support for offenders once they're ex-offenders and leaving prison. It seems that probation is now about sort of public protection, and the slightest risk to public, no, we won't release them. And I think that while there's always going to be mistakes made, and there will be cases where, okay, we got it wrong with that person, it certainly seems that the emphasis is not to release people until there's a greater level of confidence. And I think as a consequence of that, there's far more people who actually could probably be released and not reoffend, who are not getting that opportunity, than there are those who are being released and are a risk. But I think that's the way it has to be. And certainly there's been a lot of complaints amongst probation when the whole thing was sort of cut back in terms of offender management. A little bit out of date now the last few years about how that's all going. But it's very, very challenging to get that whole thing right. But I do know it's a very, very complicated and strong procedure, and a difficult procedure for prisoners to get through to be released.
And to make things absolutely clear, if you're out on parole, you are still pretty comprehensively supervised by the probation service, and you can be re-imprisoned if necessary.
Well, that's right. Yes. I mean, I've not worked with probation outside, so I probably know a little more than you do about how well they do the job. And I know there's some sort of controversy over tagging and various things like that. But you see, people don't often realize, when people talk about, well, life is supposed to mean life when you have lifers, but actually, of course, the sentence is for life. It's the custodial part of the sentence that's the prison. But when you're convicted of for life sentence, then you have that hanging over you till the end of your life, and that means there's always going to be some restrictions. You might never be able to leave the UK, for instance. There might be an area you're never going to be allowed to live. You might have to constantly keep reporting in. So there is still part of that sentence, and it stays on in your file, of course, as well. So in terms of employment and what have you, it's not that when you go out after 10, 15 years of a life sentence, then you're as free as everybody else. No, you're always going to carry that with you. And of course, probation will be there as part of that as well.
Part of the function, yeah. You did tell me that you were suicide family liaison officer, which sounds quite grim, actually, in terms of having to sort of tell people what had happened. Did you experience many suicides?
There was probably 3 or 4 in the 15 years which I was directly involved in terms in some kind of support or what have you. Yeah, suicide is a problem in prison, but there's a very good system in place for self-harmers and suicidal. But one of the things that I found interesting, and I'm sure statistics will bear this out, is that suicide and self-harm are actually 2 separate things. In fact, most self-harmers would never ever seriously contemplate committing suicide, although some have committed suicide accidentally by taking the self-harm to an extreme. And often the self-harmers are more likely to ask for help and support to help them deal with the issues that are causing them to be tempted to self-harm. But occasionally, perhaps it may be even more often than not, prisoners who commit suicide might be unknown in terms of not being a self-harmer, and their reasons for ending their life are often very different from self-harmers. But being a family liaison officer, it's not just about suicide. A family liaison officer, it's not a chaplain's role. It could be a governor or a senior officer, or a chaplain, of course, as in my case, who's very similar, same training as the police family liaison officers have. And our job really is, when there's been a death in custody, whatever the reason, it's the FLO's job to go out, often with a chaplain or a governor or someone else, to visit the person's home to break the news, and then to support the family right through even to the coroner's court and inquest and everything, to help support them through that, and to link. And that might mean the prisoner's family coming into the prison to see their cell, to pick up their belongings, and to meet with governors or staff who knew the prisoner. So there's an awful lot of support put in place when there's been death in custody. And I've dealt with about 9 deaths in custody in the time I was.
And some of those have been what, illness or old age or?
Yes, most of them were natural causes, old age or illness, but I think about 3 of them were suicides.
How easy is it for somebody to commit suicide in prison? Because you'd think that most of the tools that you'd need to commit suicide are not available.
It's surprising how ingenious prisoners can be when they've made up their minds to end their life. Certainly when it comes if there's been an attempted suicide, then obviously at that point, then the self-harm situation, process gets put into place. So there'll be cell searches to make sure they haven't got any kind of not just weapons, but any kind of means of taking their life or what have you. But unfortunately, when someone's determined enough, then they'll usually find means to do it.
It's very sad when that takes place, no doubt about that.
It has a huge effect on the staff as well.
Yeah, sure, because it must hit everybody really. And I think I've always thought that suicide always hurts the ones that are left. Forget about prison, just look at normal life. It's the ones that are left who are always going to say, did I play a part in pushing this person over the edge? Yeah, but there we are. Francis Crook, retiring Chief Executive Officer of the Howard League for Penal Reform, quoted the other day that prison is the last unreformed institution. Do you think she's right?
I can understand the reasoning for that comment. I think most people would accept the fact that there's probably a lot more, and maybe a lot more different approaches that need to be put into place. But there's no easy solution. We can look at the problem and say this isn't the best way of doing it, but actually, well, then how can we do it in a way that's going to be more effective? And I think that the more recent emphasis on restorative justice and then looking on, and then when there's the forgiveness project and other things that actually are not always very popular with those who say, well, just lock them up and throw the key away attitude. But actually, when we were actually trying to see how we can help people who might make that decision I mentioned earlier, that each prisoner needs to make, I don't want to live this life anymore. Trying to find the best way of helping them, depends very much on their situation. But I've had the privilege of being involved in the restorative justice work, where I've helped support a face-to-face meeting, and it's ranged from someone through credit card fraud who met the family who had money stolen from them by the prisoner, to somebody who was convicted of murder and met with the young sister of the murdered victim. And it was quite powerful and quite an emotional time to see, after 9 months preparation, for instance, before the first meeting, which, as you talked about, the time production, there was an example of that restorative justice going on there. And that actually, I think the prisoners that I've been involved in that said, that's had more impact on me than all the years I've done in prison. To sit and see how what I did affected the victim, and realizing the impact, actually, even for the lad who was for credit card fraud was broken by it. He just could not believe how much upset he'd caused. So I personally think the more we can do with restorative justice is definitely going to be one of the ways we'll see a better reformed institution.
As percentages go, how many people would actually take that route? It's pretty low percentage, is it, at the moment?
It is, because both prisoners and the victims need to agree and to it, and it needs to be victim focused, and that's the main issue. That this is not just to make life easy for the prisoner. The main person to benefit should be the victim, but actually it's something that the offender can benefit from as well. I remember one situation where somebody had stolen money from a charity shop, and after their meeting and got together, he was totally broken by realizing what he'd done, and they were very forgiving. And with probation support, and probably now that is a situation for him, they said they'd even offer him a job as a volunteer in their charity shop that he'd actually knocked off. So it can be quite powerful. But for most, the majority of prisoners, now they won't be interested in that, and they also agree to it as well, of course, as the victim.
I mean,
crime option is the other thing I was going to mention as well, where we do get reformed characters going into prison, especially with young offenders, to try and actually divert them away from crime, to say, look, your life does not have to be like this. And that's another initiative that I think, will have some impact on us, on a minority of offenders.
I mean, a lot of them, when they come out of prison, find it difficult to get employment. But I think Sir John Timpson, who runs the Timpson key cutting, and see at least one in every town, has gone out of his way to actually employ people that have come out of prison, and it seems to have worked well.
Yes, that's right. And I knew guys in my last prison who went to work for local Timpsons as well. And I think it's good that employers do this work, because employment is definitely one of the factors that helps people avoid continuing their life of crime. And
I guess if somebody's been working for Timpsons for a few years, if they then have to want to move on to another job with somebody else, it's on their CV that they've been with Timpsons, it's on their CV they've been to prison. But in many ways, their time at Timpsons would almost be a probationary period in terms of recommending them to other employers, wouldn't it?
Well, I think this is one of the important things that probation can do. I remember one good friend of mine now who spent some time in prison. He's been out of prison for a couple of decades now, and he was involved in violent crime, and his whole life was messed up. I mean, as a chaplain, I found it a particularly encouraging story, because he became a Christian while he was in prison. But when he went out, when he was released finally from his last sentence, and he got a job as a road sweeper, the amount of money he got for one day, he could have got for in a few minutes of crime that he beforehand. But he said because it was a day's pay, that amount of money was worth a lot more to him in terms of he worked hard for this, and it gave him a much better sense of the value of money. And that was an important lesson, that employment can actually, even though it may not pay as well as crime, it actually can be a much more rewarding experience.
William Hague, Lord Hague, recently wrote an article, I think it was in the Times, advertising legalization of all drugs to cut prison numbers. But you've got some views on that in terms of the concoctions that they come up with.
Well, yes, there's always going to be something which is so dangerous that actually nobody should be allowed to inject themselves with it or smoke it, what have you. And spice, what was it called originally called legal highs, that eventually became illegal because they're so dangerous. Are far more dangerous than marijuana, and other drugs. I'm not saying that it's okay to have any drugs. I wouldn't. I wouldn't like to come across as being, pro drugs at all. But when you actually, walking around the wings as a prison officer or as a chaplain, and you smell someone's burning some cannabis or what have you, then okay, you report it, get it sorted out, and what have you. But when you hear of prison officers being blue lighted out to hospital because they inhaled some spice that a prisoner was smoking, and you realize, well, actually, there's got to be limits. You can't just legalize everything because, it means people going to prison. There's got to be safety built into all of that. So, I don't think we'll get very far on that one.
Finally, happy memories.
Yes, I'm glad we've come up with that one. There's a couple. I mean, a very early one was when I was doing some evening work. When in the days when you could actually have prisoners out of their cells up to about 8 p.m. It's much earlier than that now. We'd have a meeting in the chapel where we'd sing a few songs ready for the chapel service. But I could see that the guys were really not feeling very happy. And so I said, well, what's the problem? And two guys said, well, I'm really annoyed with my mate Rob because he didn't get his tobacco from canteen and he's in debt, so he's going to get his head kicked in when he goes back to the unit. He's terrified. So I said, well, I felt, what can I do for the guy? So I said, well, would you like to pray for him? He said, yeah, okay, I'll pray for him. I've never done that before. How do I do that? So I said, well, just say what you want to say and start with our dear God and finish with amen. So he prayed for him. So I hope he doesn't get his head kicked in. He's not stupid enough to get in debt again. Amen. And his face lit up. He said, wow, I've never done that before. His mate was in tears. And he said, well, why are you so upset? He said, it's the first time another inmate's ever prayed for me. and and by the end of that meeting, other guys have dragged their pockets, given him a bit of tobacco so he could pay his debt.
Right.
And he went back, happy man. And I thought, there was a result there. It's a minor thing maybe, but it's one of those things that
that's stuck in your brain. Yeah. Got any other reminiscences?
One other thing, is about the privilege of doing, what we do is, as chaplains and priests and what have you. And this particular one was the segregation unit, or the block, as it's sort of referred to, where, it's like a prison within a prison. And the only people they actually get to see down the block is the governor, the doctor if needed, and the chaplain. And the officers, of course, are looking after them. So we go around every day. Chaplain goes every day, and usually they say, "You're right, yeah, fine, okay." You just knock on the door or what have you. One guy was in the exercise yard. You can't see anything but the sky because the big walls up, what have you. And there's a concrete block in the middle to sit on. No other furniture, no grass, just bare concrete and barbed wire and what have you. And they wander around for an hour or so. And he said, "Yeah, come and have a chat with me." So they locked me in with him, sat on this concrete block. And I think it must be more than an hour. He just poured his heart out. And he said, "Thank you." He said, "That means so much." And we prayed together.
Yeah.
And I just thought, what a privilege. There'd be nobody else in the world who would have the opportunity that I had to sit with this guy and be there for him. And it's just that sense of privilege that the role, being a chaplain, being a priest has. Which I still feel even here on Alderney in some of the situations I get involved in.
Makes it all worthwhile.
Absolutely.
Tony, it's been an absolute privilege to talk to you. Thanks so much for sparing me some time. And no doubt we'll have a chat in the future about something else, perhaps.
Well, thank you very much for your interest and anybody else who's watching.
Thank you.